We have breaking news this evening. The NHL and the Players Association have come to terms on the Phase 3 and 4 protocols for the return to play and are apparently really close on getting an agreement in place for a CBA extension as well. We're also going to take a look at some free agent rumors concerning guys like Taylor Hall and Alex Pietrangelo. We'll jump into all the latest news coming up next. So welcome back to another video here at Top Shelf Hockey. Now, as I mentioned, we have the big breaking news tonight that we finally have agreements from the NHL and the Players Association on the Phase 3 and 4 protocols to kind of finalize a return to play. Now, they're also really close to getting a CBA extension in place, and we have information from NHL insiders suggesting that that very well could come as early as this evening. If not, it's not expected to get past tomorrow. So sometime in the next 24 hours would be my guess by the sounds of things. We should have a memorandum of understanding on a CBA extension as well. Of course, we already went through a lot of the details that were leaked and expected to be in a new CBA in the past couple of days, but now we have full details on the Phase 3 and 4 protocols that have been agreed to by guys like Bob McKenzie and Elliot Friedman and Chris Johnson reporting here on Twitter this evening. So let's give a breakdown of what's all expected to take place here during Phase 3 and 4. Now, prior to entering Phase 3, all players will be tested 48 hours ahead of time. Of course, they have to test negative in order to participate. They will be tested every other day after that during this whole process. Now, of course, at any point in time, if there's any delay in test results coming back, which are expected to be 24 hours, then the player or staff member will have to stay away from the team and self-isolate while they remain for those results. And of course, the result would have to come back as a negative test result for them to resume participation here. So they're going to be tested quite frequently as this process goes on. We did learn as well that the NHL players' families will not be able to go with them in the beginning. Families will only be able to join their respective teams and players once we reach the conference finals and the finals, which I mentioned are expected to be taking place in Edmonton at that hub location, which Toronto being the other one for the first part of this series. But obviously that's kind of a big blow in a way for families. So some of the teams that are going to be losing early on will probably go around 5 weeks without seeing their families. Obviously, if they advance to later stages, then we'll go even longer. And obviously, with the ones making it to the conference finals and finals, they'll be able to have their families come join them if they wish during that part of the playoffs. But of course, it's going to be quite a while in between. So that's certainly a big sacrifice for the players on their part to make this happen. Now, as we've mentioned before, players are able to opt out of playing in this summer playoff tournament. All they have to do is tell their teams that they're not participating. Simple as that. No questions asked, no penalties of any kind. Right now, they're saying that players need to notify their clubs by, I believe it was Tuesday evening. Now, that date could change because obviously it depends on when the full players go to vote on this, because obviously they're not going to vote on the Phase 3-4 protocols until the CBA portion of this is done. And like I said, that's expected to be done either this evening or tomorrow. Of course, players are going to need a couple of days to vote on this, so that Tuesday deadline could push back 1, maybe 2 days, just depends on when the vote begins. But basically it sounds like once voting begins, they're going to have to be expected to let their teams know before everything is all finalized and voted on, so that they know what they're going to be having for roster. They're going to be allowed to have during Phase 3 up to 30 skaters and an unlimited number of goaltenders, so that's certainly quite a few black ices they can have on their roster as extra players kicking around due to injuries and whatnot. But the only players who can even participate are ones that are going to be eligible to play. As of right now, we have not had anything indicated that there was going to be any movement on new players getting signed that are going to be allowed to jump in. So we're looking at guys like Markov in Montreal, Kaprizov in Minnesota, a lot of these younger players that were looking to sign NHL contracts once their KHL season had finished up here. Normally if the season had continued as it normally would have, things would have been different, but they did change that rule, and as of right now we have no indication that that's going to be changing. So if a player's ineligible to play, then they're not going to be able to even be on the ice practicing with these teams. Of course, they want to keep their bubbles as tight as possible, and if you're not having a chance to play, there's no point in you being there. Just creates more risk for everybody involved. Now, another big thing here, as well as all test results throughout the entire process are going to be made private, which is the way it should be. Their private medical information should not be made public. Of course, we saw Steve Simmons of the Toronto Sun leak information about Austin Matthews of the Maple Leafs having tested positive a few weeks ago, and that type of thing will not be taking place. I mean, at least it shouldn't be. Obviously, some reporters have their sources, but the league and the teams have made it clear that they're not to be releasing any information. So if something like that did get out, I would imagine the league's going to be trying to track down how that came to be, and there could be penalties for that, but hard to say 100%, but at least good to know that their information will be remaining private. There is a clause as well during Phase 4 that indicates that they cannot leave without permission, so they have to stay within their team bubble, and if they do get out of that bubble without consent, that there could be some pretty severe punishment. Now, that includes the player himself might be kicked out of the rest of the playoffs. That's a possibility, and the teams could be facing financial risks, including fines as well as loss of draft picks. So obviously there are going to be very strict rules and protocols to be following, and if the players do not follow them and they break those rules, there's going to be very stiff penalties. Not to say that players can't leave for the right reasons. There are ways for them to get exemptions to go back home, but obviously they're not going to be any exemptions just to go, on their merry way, kind of go out and do things in the public. They're going to have to stay within their bubble and what the rules are for that. But if they are hurt or they have some kind of personal situation that really justifies them leaving to go home, they're able to do that with consent. But when they return, they do need to self-isolate for the period of time like they normally would before they can rejoin their team and get back to playing or practicing or whatever. So there's certainly some strict rules around that. Now, one very interesting clause as well, which could impact a couple of players that come to mind, is all players who haven't already had so are going to have what they call a pre-participation medical examination. So players that are already in Phase 2 on the voluntary part that are playing likely would have already gone through this, but as players come back, they're going to have to go through this. If it's determined that they're of substantial risk to developing serious illness due to contracting COVID-19, they could be deemed ineligible and unfit to play. Now, if this does happen, players can have a second opinion and dispute that and try to get themselves back into playing. The big name that comes to mind here is Max Domi of Montreal, because clearly, even though I'm sure he's a very healthy player and keeps himself in great shape, he does have type 1 diabetes, and as we know, diabetics are extremely high risk here to have a lot of complications if they contract COVID-19. I've seen numerous cases of people who have had severe complications from it, so maybe he might not be able to play. I don't know how that's going to go. We'll have to see here, but certainly he's one player that comes to mind who could be impacted. If players are tested positive during this Phase 3 and Phase 4, they will be determined to be a hockey injury, so that's likely for insurance purposes, unless it's determined that there are necessary facts in place to show that they contracted it outside of hockey-related activities. So obviously that's a good thing, though. If these players end up getting sick at all, they're certainly going to be covered and considered injured through hockey-related stuff as long as they didn't break any rules. It was also determined as well that NHL coaches, when they're behind a bench, are not mandatory. It's not required for them to wear a mask or a face covering. Of course, they can choose to do so. That's their own decision. It's not going to be made mandatory. So I know there's been a lot of talk around that because there certainly are enough NHL head coaches and assistant coaches that have certainly fall into certain high-risk categories alone just because of their age or certain health conditions as well. So that's completely up to them, and I would imagine the coaches and other staff members, like the players, could very well opt out of being involved as well if they wish. So obviously we'll have to see what happens, but certainly some major developments. We could have more this evening as well if there is more news on a new CBA agreement being reached here, memorandum of understanding. Look for another video. Otherwise, if it doesn't happen tonight, like I said, likely happens tomorrow, which we'll discuss at that point in time. But these are all the details that we know as of the recording of this video. If any more key details that are worth discussing emerge in the next little bit, by the time I finish recording to it being uploaded, look for the pinned comment down below at the top here with any additional information that might have come out since I started to sit down and record here. Now, as I mentioned, I want to take a quick look at a few free agent rumors as well for the offseason once we finally reach that point in time. There was a recent interview from Craig Button of TSN that certainly got some interesting thoughts going where he was asked about some of these free agents and where he saw them ending up, and I kind of wanted to give my take on that and see what everybody else thought as well. A couple of the names he was talking about were Alex Pietrangelo of the St. Louis Blues and Taylor Hall, currently of the Arizona Coyotes. Now, in the case of Alex Pietrangelo, the Blues captain, as we talked about before in recent days and a few times here in the last little while, the St. Louis Blues, like many teams, are going to have a lot of really hard, tough decisions to make because of the cap remaining flat. They're not going to have that increase that they were likely expecting to be able to look after a lot of these contracts. They not only have their captain, Alex Pietrangelo, but they also have RFA defenseman Vince Dunn, who we talked about yesterday, who could even potentially be an offer sheet candidate. Looking for a really solid young defenseman like him, and certainly quite a possibility. The Blues would be tough to match, depending on the amount offered, of course, and they also have some contracts in their forward group. But Craig Button felt that it's more likely now, because of the NHL season being paused and the whole landscape for free agents being changed, that maybe Pietrangelo will take a short-term contract, likely take a little bit less money than he was probably looking for in the beginning, to remain with St. Louis, at least on a short-term basis. We're probably looking at a 1, maybe a 2-year contract. Obviously, it's not ideal really for anybody to be an unrestricted free agent right now. There's many players that are not going to get paid the way they were hoping for, but I know we've seen some player agents come out and say they felt the top players would still get the money that they likely deserve, even though that, there's a lot of teams that are tough and tight up against it. But clearly there's not going to be a lot of teams that have a lot of space, and unless some of these top names want to go to some of the weaker teams near the bottom of the league, they're not going to be able to get these long-term contracts. And really, are those teams in the bottom of the league really going to be looking to sign big-time free agents? Many of them are going through rebuilds right now and are trying to build within, so it doesn't make a lot of sense for some of them to be going after some of these guys anyway. So he felt more than likely Pietrangelo stays, and I do concur with that. I think there's a pretty good chance that they figure that out, but they're going to have to make other moves. As I mentioned before, I can see certain players likely either being bought out or traded. That includes guys like Alex Steen as a forward, great depth forward, but not for what he makes right now, playing on the fourth line a lot. I think he's a buyout candidate if he can't be moved. I think Tyler Bozak's another guy going into the final year, $5 million contract. Not that they want to part with Bozak, but really for what he makes, if it means keeping their captain, I think he would go, as well as Vince Dunn, of course, another key player. And of course, there's backup goalie Jake Allen. These are the main players that I've talked about numerous times. I feel St. Louis will try to find new homes for to keep these guys, and I think that they'll find a way here that Doug Armstrong will get a deal done with his captain, at least on a short-term deal. It's going to have to be team-friendly as well, but it's in everybody's best interest right now, given the state of the league, to make that kind of deal. Now, in regards to Taylor Hall, he felt that there's a pretty good chance that he leaves Arizona, and I've stated this before. I think of all the free agents that are going to be on the market, especially some of the bigger names, Taylor Hall, to me, will be one of the toughest deals to get done to remain with his current club, even if he's willing to take a shorter-term contract with less money. The Arizona Coyotes, in my opinion, have the worst cap situation across the league, and even if they're willing to do a one-year deal with Hall, let's say he would agree to that, he's not going to play for next to nothing. They'd have to move out quite a bit to make it work. So personally, Craig Button said he felt that a good landing spot for Taylor Hall would be Colorado. And that is a team I have mentioned really since dating back before the trade deadline that I thought would be an awesome landing spot for him. And if he really wants to get into playoffs, he really wants to be on a playoff contender, I think that's a great landing spot. Now, of course, it's going to have to be short term for it to work for the Avalanche. We know that Joe Sakic, there is discussions before the deadline that he inquired about picking up Taylor Hall as a rental. So if he was willing to get him as a rental before, I would imagine he'd be willing to do a one-year deal with them now. I mean, they do have to be careful. They have some big-time youngsters coming out of their entry-level deals, like Akil Makar, who's going to need a big raise soon. Landeskog's not that far from being done. McKinnon's, has got a few years left, but they got to look out to the future here and project the new salary cap year that they're going to be dealing with for the next 2 or 3 years, and they don't want to get anything too tight here. But I can see them going after Hall on a short-term deal, really make a run out of Cup, and then see after that where things land. Maybe he doesn't stay there longer term, but really he'd be the perfect fit to complement that top six. If you put him on a line with Nathan McKinnon, that would be absolute dynamite, and I can see that being a tremendous thing. Now, of course, the other thing to keep in mind is some of these guys might be willing to take shorter-term contracts because they need to be able to basically reinvent themselves and reprove themselves over again. I mean, Taylor Hall is only a couple years removed from winning the Hart Trophy, so league's MVP, but last year wasn't the greatest. Not that his numbers were really horrible. He just didn't really click in Arizona. You know, really overall, like he needs to kind of reprove here that he can be a league MVP or close to that again to really get that longer term contract. And obviously, like I said, because of the state of the league and everybody's teams and all of these teams being so tight against the cap, it's going to be very, very challenging. And some of these players, I think, even though they might not have wanted to do this, and leading into free agency, like if we talked about this a few months ago, we said, you know, these players don't want short-term deals, and I don't blame them. I'm sure they don't, but it's going to have to mean getting a little bit less money now to get more money later, rather than sign a long-term contract that's significantly less money and maybe tie yourself up in a situation that really isn't what you want longer term. So personally, I can see Taylor Hall going to Colorado. There's going to be other teams out there that will bid for his services as well. But unless the Arizona Coyotes make a run and John Chayka gets super creative with dumping a bunch of salary, I just don't see how he can stay in the desert and remain with the Coyotes longer term. But let me know your thoughts down below. Do you see Pietrangelo staying with the Blues? If not, where do you see him going? And same with Taylor Hall. Do you think there's any way Arizona can retain him? If not, where's a good landing spot? Is it Colorado? Or if it's a different team, give me your thoughts in the comments. If you're new to the channel, consider subscribing and turning on your notifications so you don't miss any future content. And give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it. I'd appreciate it if you did. As always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you next time.